Hi there, my name's Patrick Denny and welcome to this short video presentation on the early history of Colchester. In particular, I'm going to be looking at the period from around AD 43, when the Romans first invaded Britain, up until the time that Boudica and her forces destroyed Colchester less than 20 years later. And it's going to be a PowerPoint presentation. So what I'm going to do is share my screen with you now, and we'll go to the title slide, and here it is. And you'll see here that it's Colchester, the Roman Conquest, and Boudicas Revenge. And I think it might be interesting just to mention at this point that Colchester, prior to the Romans coming in AD 43, Colchester, or Camulodunum, as it was known in those days, was the Iron Age capital of Britain. And of course, after the Romans arrived, it went on to become the Roman capital of Britain for many years before it moved to London. And another fact that many people will be aware of is that Colchester is recognised as the oldest recorded town in Britain. And I thought we could start by just talking a little bit about that. And I'm showing you this slide now. This is the road coming up to what we call the Tesco roundabout. It comes down from the University of Essex or from Wivenhoe. But you'll see on the side of the road there are signs there welcoming people to the oldest recorded town. And if we just blow one of these up, you'll see that it says Colchester, Britain's oldest recorded town. Please drive carefully. So what justification have we got for saying that Colchester is the oldest recorded town in Britain? Well, you know, the key word is on this word recorded. And for something to be recorded, it could be written down in some form. It could be a coin with some writing on. It could be a tombstone or something like that with some writing on. But I think most people, when they think of something written down, they think of ancient writings maybe in a book or something like that. And the oldest of any of the ancient writings that mention any town or city in Britain was written by this man here, Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Elder in AD 77, published his natural history. Incidentally, just 2 years later, he lost his life at the eruption of Mount Vesuvius near Pompeii. But anyway, in his natural history, in one section, he was discussing the extended daylight hours that you can see in some parts of the Northern Hemisphere where, you know, the sun never sets. And he was talking about this happening in Greenland and places like that. But he also mentioned, he says that some say this also happens in Mona. Now, Mona is modern day Anglesey off the north coast of Wales. And Pliny, he may have thought, well, hang on a minute. Nobody probably knows where Mona is. My readers back in Italy probably never heard of it. So he adds a few words to clarify exactly where Mona is. And these are the words that he adds, look, you'll see them here. He says, and some say that it all also happens in Mona. And then he adds this extra line, look, which is about 200 miles from the British town of Camulodunum. And there it is. Everybody's heard of Camulodunum, but they didn't know, had maybe heard of Mona. And that is the first mention of any British town of any size mentioned by any of the ancient writers. So I think we're on fairly firm ground when we say that Colchester is the oldest recorded town in Britain. Now here we can see a map of Iron Age Britain. And in this map, you'll see that the whole country, the whole of the United Kingdom, or Great Britain rather, is divided up into these various tribes. There's over 20 of them. And each of these tribal kingdoms had their own king or queen. So they didn't have like a global monarchy like they might have today. And down the bottom here, where Essex is located now, and perhaps part of Suffolk, was the area of the Trinovantes. They were a tribe. And the centre, or the capital, if you like, of the Trinovantes was Camulodunum, modern day Colchester. And in the years leading up to the Roman conquest, up until about 3 years before they came, the leader of the Trinovantes was a man called Cunoblin. You see his name at the top here. Some people called him Cunobelinus. some of the Romans actually called him Britannorum Rex, which means King of the Britons. And it seems that at the height of Cunoblin's rulership, not only was he controlling the Trinovantian area, but it seems that he may have also annexed many of the tribes in southern England also under his control. So he became a very powerful king indeed. And the Romans recognized that. And so when the Romans decided to invade Britain, they obviously assumed rightly that if we capture Cunoblin's capital, Camulodunum, then we've captured Britain. And that, of course, is what happened. And this was the man who started it all off. This is the Emperor Claudius, and he was the emperor who amassed 4 legions together to invade Britain in 43. The legions, there was 4 of them, but attached to the legions were all the auxiliary forces who went with the legions. Altogether, we could be talking of a force up to about 40,000 troops that came across the Channel. We know that they met stiff opposition when they arrived here from some of the ancient writers. And they fought their way through Kent. They landed in Kent. They crossed the Medway. They crossed the Thames. And it seems that when they got into Essex near the Thames, they halted and waited for Claudius to arrive, because apparently Claudius wanted to come as well. And he was probably following at a safe distance behind the main invasion force. But it's quite unusual for an emperor to leave the safety of Rome. But Claudius obviously did. And in Rome itself, there was like a giant legion protecting Rome. It was called the Praetorian Guard. And Claudius probably took a detachment of the Praetorian Guard, maybe a few hundred, maybe 1,000 or more, as a personal bodyguard to accompany him across Europe and over into Britain. And we're also told that Claudius took a band of elephants with him as well, which is quite interesting as well. Anyway, Claudius duly arrived, caught up with the invasion force, and it was Claudius who went on to Camulodunum and took the surrender of the natives there. And in another interesting fact about Claudius is that he's the only person mentioned in the Bible who we know has been to Colchester. He's mentioned twice actually in the Bible, in the book of Acts. This is one of them. This is Acts chapter 18 verses 1 and 2. You can look at this later in your own Bibles. It reads, after this he departed, that's the Apostle Paul, he departed from Athens and came to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus who had recently come from Italy. He'd actually come with his wife Priscilla as well. Why did they come? Because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. That's quite interesting, isn't it? I don't know about you, but I doubt there's many towns and cities in Britain who can claim that a biblical character has visited their town. So anyway, let's move on. Into Colchester, Claudius arrives. And I'm showing you now a wonderful reconstruction drawing by a chap called Peter Frost. Now, Peter Frost is an artist who has been working very closely with the Colchester Archaeological Trust for many, many years, and doing these lovely drawings of reconstructions so we can see what old Colchester may have looked like. And I'll talk more about, I shall be using some of Peter's other pictures later on in this presentation. I'll talk also right at the end a bit more about him. But in this illustration, we can see the Emperor Claudius in Colchester here, and he's accepting the tributes and the surrender of some of these other kings, apparently up to 11 surrendered to him while he was here in Britain. And notice Peter's also included an elephant look just on the left-hand side here. Claudius himself didn't remain in Colchester for long. He only stayed here for about 2 weeks, and then he returned back to Rome. And when he returned to Rome, he was received as a returning hero, and the Senate of Rome awarded him a triumph, a great victory parade of the city, which was probably one of the highest honours they could bestow upon him. But the legions, of course, they remained back in Britain, and it was the 20th Legion that stayed in Colchester, and they erected on the site of our modern town centre, where the high street and all the shops are today, they built what was to become the first Roman legionary fortress in Britain. And in this slide, it depicts the building of that fortress. We can see here in the centre of the Balkan Gateway, Part of that Balkan Gateway, of course, still survives. And down here on the right-hand side, one of the barrack blocks that would have held all the soldiers. Each of these barrack blocks would have been over 200 feet long. And eventually they completed it, and it would have looked in plan form something like this. Most Roman legionary fortresses were built to a fairly standard layout, so we know roughly what it would have looked like. One of the things they always had, the main road dissecting the dividing it into two, was a north-south road that ran right through the centre of the fortress here. And you can see it depicted on this drawing here, again by Peter Frost. And if you look at this large area here, there's an open space here. And you know that, or interestingly, that almost lines up exactly with the modern day Culver Centre in the Culver Precinct. And let's just have a look at that. Here is the Culver Square in the Culver Precinct. And if you look at those buildings standing on the far side, they would be standing right behind where that Roman road would have ran along between the military fortress. And you see this building over here that I'm highlighting here. Well, that's this building here. This, in fact, was the old library in Colchester, and it's the only building that survives from the pre-Culver Precinct days. But if you want to go from the precinct down, say, to Culver Street at this end, you have to walk along this little roadway here in front of that building. And if I show you the same from the opposite direction, so this is going, if you wanted to go to the Culver Centre, you'd walk along here, and when you're walking along there, you're walking right along the same line as that Roman road that ran right north-south through the legionary fortress. And in this photograph, taken in the 1980s, which is quite interesting, I quite like this. This shows Philip Crummy standing on the right here. Philip is the director of Colchester Archaeological Trust, has been for many years, and has been in charge of many of the big excavations in Colchester during the years. Standing next to him is another well-known archaeologist, that's Howard Brooks, and they're standing on the Roman road surface. They've actually excavated right down, and they're standing on that very road that I was speaking about. So that's the Roman street level. And if you look above where Philip's standing, you may spot somebody, just about spot somebody standing higher up. And he is standing on the modern street level. And you'll notice that that's about 6 feet higher than the old Roman one. If you look below the Roman street level here, this is natural subsoil. This is just sand and gravel. But then, and there's the Roman surface, the Roman road. And if you look above that, you can see about 6 feet of dark layers here. And that represents nearly 2,000 years of human habitation being built up over the centuries, rebuilding, rebuilding, rebuilding. So when you walk along that roadway now, if you're going to the Culver Centre, you need to imagine that the Roman street was quite a few feet below the modern street level. In time, the Roman fortress was disbanded. In fact, it didn't last too long at all. So from 43, when it was started, by about 49, the Romans had decided they didn't want their presence in Colchester anymore. The 20th Legion was moved to another part of the country, and what was the fortress was converted for civilian use. So all the old barrack blocks would have eventually been taken down. They didn't take all the footings right up, but they levelled it to ground level. And then they actually built on top of the foundations of these fortress buildings, civilian buildings, including theatres. We can see a theatre depicted here. There would have been bathhouses, everything you might have expected from a large Roman town or city. In fact, they called this a colonia. And if you look down the bottom, it was actually titled Colonia Claudia Victoricensis. And this depicts as it may have looked about 250. And this means the colony of the Claudian victory. And a Roman colonia, I mean, we would probably use the word colony. A Roman colonia was a settlement that the Romans set up in the far-flung provinces around the Roman Empire to settle Roman veterans. Roman soldiers who had retired from the Roman army after they'd completed their 25 or so year service, they were granted a free tract of land in one of the provinces around the Roman world that they've captured, and they came and settled there in large numbers, and that of course helped to instill the Roman way of life in these provinces. And so we might have expected there could have been, you know, maybe 2,000 Roman veterans and their families, children, along with local people as well, settled here. And you can easily see the population could have been easily above something like 10,000. Another building depicted here, over here, is the great Roman Temple of Claudius. And here's a close-up view. Now, the Roman Temple of Claudius was built about 54, AD 54. Claudius, you may remember, came here in 43. Well, he died in 54. And at that time, you need to remember that the Romans were very much into emperor worship, and they worshipped these dead emperors as gods. In fact, on some occasions, I think they worshipped some of them while they were still alive. But in order to facilitate the worship of the god Claudius, they built temples to do this. And they built these temples all over the place, certainly in central Rome. But because of Claudius's association with Britain and his great victory here, they also decided to build a great temple of Claudius in Britain. And of course, they built it here in Colchester. And part of that temple, certainly the foundation, all Roman temples sat on a big stone platform called a podium. And at the front of that, you had steps running up to the front. And that great podium still survives beneath Colchester Castle. Nearly 1,000 years after the Romans built it, when the Normans came, and that's another story, but they built their castle right over the foundation podium of the Temple of Claudius. And visitors to Colchester Castle today can go on a guided tour underneath the castle, and they can go into that foundation. And when they're standing in there, or they can even touch the wall, they will be standing in the first large stone and mortar building ever constructed in this country. I'm not including Stonehenge or the little stone huts in the Orkneys in this equation, but the Temple of Claudius would surely have been the first large stone and mortar building ever constructed in Britain. And of course, part of it is still here. The Romans, of course, didn't use temples like we might have go into a church or cathedral to worship. In fact, they worshipped outside. And in this illustration, if you look at the bottom of the steps, you can see a small altar here, look, with people lined up, ready with their animal sacrifices. The temple itself, if you view it like this, it was the house of the god, God's house. This is where Claudius was to dwell, if you like. And inside there would be a great statue of Claudius. And people often wonder why, you see, these people depicted here are quite tiny compared with these massive great columns. Well, because the statue would have been about 30 plus, 35, even 40 feet high. If it was the Temple of Athena, it would be a great statue of Athena. And these statues were very big. They were decorated with jewels and things like this. So this was the main reason for the temple, to house a statue of the god. And of course, there may have been other valuables and things like that as well kept in there. The temple itself also stood in a great big courtyard, or what they sometimes call a temple precinct. And in this black and white illustration, we can see the Temple of Claudius in the background. And in front here, a large monumental entranceway, flanked either side by a large arcade of arches running in both directions. In fact, this colonnade here, this arcade ran for about 120 meters, over 400 feet. It was actually nearly 400 feet. It was actually enormous. If you look to the left of this illustration, you'll see a red circle. And that's to let you know that just recently, just a few years ago, when new building work was taking place in this area in front of what is now the castle, archaeologists uncovered the remains of some of those columns and some of that arcade there, and they were able to record it. And if we look at this little building complex here now, just in front of the castle, this was built by a group called the Flying Trade Group, They call it the Claudius Gateway. But when they were building it, they were building apartments. So above here, there's various apartments. And I think the original plan was to maybe put apartments on the ground floor as well, or maybe they were going to put a big restaurant there or something like that. But when the archaeologists went in and uncovered these remains, the owners decided to leave the bottom open and create a wonderful interpretation centre where people of Colchester and visitors to the town can go there and have a look at these wonderful remains. I'm just going to show you a couple of views of what it's like inside. It truly is amazing. There's a massive screen there where they show you illustrations of what the temple itself and what the colonnade, the arch, the arcade would have looked like. There are interpretation panels on the wall. There's places to sit. There's three large areas cut out in the floor where they've got reinforced glass over. Each of these are about 3 meters by 3 meters. And visitors can look through here and see the actual foundations of that massive arcade, and also have a look at these illustrations which I spoke about earlier. This arcade is the largest arcade of its kind in Northern Europe. It's certainly the largest in Britain. As I said earlier, it's about 120 meters in width. About 4 years ago, they did find another one in northern France, which they thought was amazing, and that was only 70 meters. They found that in 2014. So ours is absolutely enormous, and an amazing, amazing find. Now, the Temple of Claudius, which I said, was built from about 54, didn't last long to start with. By 60, it was almost destroyed within the Boudican revolt. Now here we're looking at a statue of Queen Boudica with her two daughters. You can see one of her two daughters depicted on her chariot, and many will know this is the statue that's currently on the Westminster embankment near Westminster Bridge. Now, Boudica was the queen of the Iceni tribe. This was another tribe, you may have seen it on the map, the north part of East Anglia, in present-day Norfolk. And her husband, King Prasutagus, had forged an alliance state with Rome. And he had willed, in the event of his death, that half of his land, half of his wealth, half of his estates would go to the emperor, and the other half would go to his family. And people say, well, why would you offer half of your wealth to Rome? Well, he probably realized that they would have taken it anyway. We know from the Roman historian Tacitus that the local Trinovantes, some of the nobles, had been dispossessed of their lands and they had been turned into slaves. So I suppose that Prasutagus thought that by appeasing the Romans in this way, by offering half of his wealth to them, at least his family would be provided for. They would have the other half. Now, of course, we know what happened next. When Prasutagus did finally die in AD 60, the Romans reneged on all these agreements. They took everything, took all his land and estates. His wife Boudica was flogged in front of her own people. Her two daughters were raped, and it sparked off this massive rebellion, this massive revolt. Now, numbers vary as to how big this army was that Boudica put together, but some estimates had it at over 200,000. But however many it was a huge army. Various tribes would have all joined in. Local Trinovantes, I'm sure, would have joined in to the Iceni, the Catavalorni from the Hertfordshire area. A mass army would have got together, and the first place that they headed for was Colchester. This was the symbol, if you like. This was the capital of Roman Britain, and this is where they came. And they completely ended up destroying it by fire. And here we've got another illustration showing what Roman culture probably looked like at the time, about 60. The Roman buildings are still, some of them are still there, but you can see they're starting to build a theatre just behind where I am, the Temple of Claudius. So it's being converted from the fortress into the colonia. And they swept in here they had neglected the defences. They were concentrating on doing civilian buildings, and the place was set on fire. This illustration, again by Peter Frost, shows the temple itself being engulfed in flames, and the mob in front of the temple. We don't know really what happened to all the population. Many of them must have fled. Many must have died. Tacitus, the Roman historian, actually says that many of them retreated into the temple, where they barricaded themselves in, and they withheld for about 2 days before finally the roof was set on fire, and they were probably taken away to their secret groves and probably ritually slaughtered. It must have been a terrific time. Imagine, I mean, that would have been a stone building. Once they were shut in, it probably would have been difficult to get at them. But imagine being in there, probably being in darkness with your family, hearing all the noise outside, hoping and praying that another legion, they expected the 9th Legion, was on their way from Lincolnshire to relieve them, but they were ambushed. So they were left to suffer their fate. But it wasn't just the temple that was destroyed. It seems that the whole of Colchester was set on fire. And it's not as though they just set a fire to a building and let the fire spread of its own accord. It seems that they probably systematically torched every single building to completely obliterate the town from the map. And the reason why we say this is that over the last 50 years or so, when archaeologists have been working on the big shopping centres and what have you in Colchester, almost every single time when they get down to the Roman levels, they find clear evidence of a massive inferno. It's something sometimes like a big level of charred remains, 8 or 10 inches thick, and buildings burnt, floors burnt. And of course the archaeologists can date that precisely to about 61. And of course Boudica then went on to do the same to London. London was destroyed by fire. So was St Albans, before she was finally defeated by the Romans later on. In this illustration, another illustration here, a vivid illustration showing the Boudica's army rampaging through the town, setting fire to buildings, causing havoc and alarm. And in this illustration here again, if you notice, I've put this yellow circle here. And it's somewhere within this yellow circle was a building where there was a couple, at least a couple, a husband and wife, Roman couple, who were living there at the time of the Boudican revolt. And they must have been terrified. And we know that in their room where they lived, and we know this because nearly 2,000 years later, archaeologists excavated the room that they lived in. And in that very room, they found the human remains of at least one person who they believe may have died violently. That could have been during the Boudican revolt. And what we also know, that as they were preparing to flee their home, the revolt's obviously taking place, and they got their jewellery, their valuables, and they put them in a little box, and they hurriedly dug a little pit, a little hole in the floor, and put them in there and covered it over. They probably had to flee at the last minute, and they fled away. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know whether they survived, whether they were killed. If they were killed, they would probably suffer a terrible death. The Roman historian Cassius Dio speaks about how the ancient Britons, if they caught people, particularly the women, they suffered a terrible, terrible fate. So we don't know what happened to them, but what we do know, they didn't come back and get their treasure. They didn't come back and get their jewels. And in this illustration again, this is that later version. Again, you've got the circle there showing you where this couple lived. This would be the main high street here. And today, of course, that is the site of Fenwick's store. Now, recently, some of you may remember that this used to be Williams and Griffins department store. And just a few years ago, there was a big refurbishment carried out, and the store was taken over by Fenwick's. And before they completed the building work, archaeologists went in there and recording what they could find. And they went into this very little room where this couple lived, into this very little house. And on the second from last day, before the excavation was to come to a conclusion, they uncovered that little hoard, that little jewels that they'd put in the floor. And they uncovered it in August 2014. And it was uncovered by Adam Whiteman, depicted here, who was the lead archaeologist at the time. The interesting thing is, as I said, the very next day, the archaeologists had to clear away from the site. The contractors were going to move in. They can't delay it any longer. And he was just probably finishing off, just tidying up this particular room. And when he was dusting down, something glinted, and he realized he discovered some gold. And he carefully started uncovering it. And it started to show that there was maybe some bracelets and some gold and various other things in here. To really excavate it properly would have taken several days, and they never had time. So what they decided to do was to take up the whole clod of earth that all this little jewellery hoard was in. They put that then into a plastic container and took it away to a place of safety where over the following days, weeks and maybe months they could carefully unravel and unpick what was in this little hoard here, this little treasure trove. And it contained a variety of gold. There was lots of gold jewellery and also some silver jewellery. And it's been suggested that the gold jewellery may have belonged to the wife, the lady of the house, whereas the silver may have been, the man, the husband, which was quite normal apparently. But this is what they eventually uncovered. This is some of the jewellery they uncovered. Along the top, you can see 5 gold finger rings. On the left are 2 gold bracelets. And on the right-hand side, you can see a pair of gold earrings. And this is only a small selection of that wonderful jewellery hoard. Now, since then, experts have been looking at this. Now, the amazing thing is it's been difficult for them to find something to compare it with. I mean, nothing like this has ever been discovered in Britain before. And the only thing that they can really compare it with is what's been discovered in places like Pompeii. So this truly is an amazing find. Now, the owners of the site, Phoenix, very generously have donated free of charge this entire jewellery hoard to Colchester Castle Museum, where it's now on display and can be seen by the public. Before they did that, however, they had a special display cabinet made up, and they took this jewellery up into their Bond Street store in the West End of London and had it on display in the jewellery department there for about 6 months. And then it's been moved now to Colchester Castle, and here it is in the castle on display, the complete collection, which was a wonderful find. Now, we're almost at the end. I just want to briefly speak about the main source material that I've used in this short programme. On the left, you can see The City of Victory. That's a book published by Philip Crummy. Philip Crummy, as I said, has been the director for many, many years. And this book that he published some time ago now contains all you really need to know about Roman Colchester. It's available in all good bookshops, and you can also buy it in Roman Circus House in Colchester. And included in the City of Victory book are lots and lots of Peter Frost's lovely illustrations. They certainly are worth looking at, and I would recommend you have a look at that. On the right hand side is one of the volumes of this journal called The Colchester Archaeologist. It's also published by the Colchester Archaeological Trust, available at Roman Circus House as well. And this is volume number 27. And I've put this here because this is where lots of the material came. There's a couple of bloody articles in here, including a full description of the Fenwick treasure and how it was discovered, and also about the lovely monumental Roman arcade that was discovered in front of where the temple used to be. And this is where we have to come to an end. I hope what I've said has been of some interest to you. It is, of course, to be continued. There's lots more to say about the history of Colchester, and I hope that you'll consider joining me again in another one of these courses that we're planning to hold in the future. So thanks very much, and thanks for watching.